If your React app feels slow when rendering large lists, filtering data, or switching tabs, this video will fix that. In this tutorial, I'll teach you one of the most powerful performance hooks in React, known as the useTransition. You'll learn what problem it solves, how it works behind the scenes, and exactly when to use it, using real examples in Next.js. To get started with this tutorial, you can use Next.js. I'll be using Next.js for this tutorial. But alternatively, if you do not need to install Next.js, what you can do, you can just move inside your browser and you can search for React Playground like this. Great. Then you can just click on the first link and it will take you to something like this. You can write your code here. This is just for testing this tutorial. First, you're looking at the definition of useTransition. So what is useTransition? So think of useTransition as a React hook that renders part of the UI in the background. Think of useTransition like a traffic light. Let's say you have cars that are moving in the slow lane and you also have cars that are moving in the fast lane. So useTransition will act as a traffic light to ensure that cars that are moving on the fast lane are given first priority compared to the cars that are moving on the slower lane. To get started, we first need to look at the syntax of useTransition. So the syntax of useTransition is like this. You have constant and we have an isPending state here and a function known as startTransition. And we're equating this to useTransition. useTransition takes no argument. So actually, useTransition is a hook that lets you render a part of the user interface in the background. And its syntax looks like this. So we have an isPending, and we also have another function here known as startTransition, and we're equating this one to useTransition. isPending is a flag, and it tells us whether the task, this function startTransition, has actually finished executing. So isPending can either be true or false. In this first example, we are going to look at the importance of useTransition when you're fetching data. So we are working with Next.js. Ensure that you have useClient at the top. You also need to import useTransition from React, and you can just leave this on here. Great. The next thing we need is we need a post. Therefore, we're going to have a variable that is going to hold the posts. Therefore, you can just call this one posts. And you're also going to have a function set post. We are going to use useState. Therefore, you can import useState here above. We need to provide the type of this post so that we can provide a type here. We know that posts is actually going to be an array. Therefore, since you are working with TypeScript, we can just introduce the type of post here. Therefore, you can just say type, and you're going to have a post, and it's going to be an object. Let me just put two attributes. Let's say an ID, which is going to be a number. It's also going to have a title. We can just say a title like this. And this title is actually a string. Therefore, you need to also provide the type here. Therefore, you can provide the type here. It's going to be of type posts, but actually an array. If you can just do this, it's going to be an array of posts. And the initial value is also going to be an empty array like that. Great job. And inside this div, we can have a h1, so we can just say h1 like this. We can just say data fetching example. Great. And inside, just below the div, we can have a button. If we can just do a button like this. And inside this button, we can even say fetch post. Great. We're also going to hook a function to this button. Therefore, you can just drop this button here, and we're going to have an onClick. You can just say onClick, and you're going to attach a function that is going to actually fetch the posts. Therefore, inside the onClick, we can just say fetch post. We do not have this function, but you're going to create this function just right away. Great. Let us create this function for fetching a post so that whenever we click fetch post, it's actually going to fetch the post. If you can just come here on top, and you're going to say async function, and you're going to call it fetch post, the function that we have just defined here. Great, like this. Right. Now that we have this function, we're going to use a dummy URL that is going to actually fetch some posts. Let us have a look at that URL. If you can just navigate inside our browser, and we have a dummy JSON placeholder. So this URL is going to provide us with some free data, and we can see the shape of the post. Therefore, the shape of the post, if you look keenly, it has a user ID, an ID, a title, and a body. But we're just interested with two. Let's say just the ID and the title. You can add this inside your shape here, the shape of your post here, but it's not necessary. Great. If you're going to fetch data from this, how can we fetch that data? We're going to declare a variable known as response, and in short form, we can just say res, and we're going to use await. So you can say await fetch, and inside it, we're going to pass the URL. Therefore, you can just pass the URL inside here. I will share the URL in the description. Therefore, I'll just copy this URL and navigate inside the browser, and I will use this URL to fetch the posts. If I'm going back inside my code and I'm pasting this URL inside here, therefore you're using an inbuilt function known as fetch. Great, and we're passing in this URL. The next thing that we need to do, we need to declare a variable known as data that is going to hold all the posts, and this data is going to be of shape posts. Therefore, we can just say posts, but it's going to be an array of posts, and we need to equate this to the response that we get. Therefore, we can say await and then response.json, like this. We are converting the response that we are getting here from this res, and we are converting it into JSON format. For a smooth operation, we need to introduce useTransition, this one here that we have. If you can just come here, and we're going to have to create a function that is known as start transition. This second function here, the second argument, not actually a function, this one here, we need to call this function, and it takes in an arrow function. If you can just do an arrow function like this, and inside this function, we're going to call this function here set post. If we can just say set post like this, and inside it, we can just pass the data that we are getting. Therefore, we can just pass the data. Great. Just below this fetch post button, what we can do, we can actually render all the posts that we are fetching. If we can do posts, and we're going to use the map function in React, and it's going to take an arrow function. Therefore, inside it, we can just take an individual post, and we're having our arrow function, and we're going to render this using a p tag. Therefore, we can just say a p tag, a HTML p tag, and inside it, we can actually render the posts.title. You can render the title. Just inside the p tag, you can say key, and it's going to be post.id, like that. Come here. Before we render these posts, we can just do this, and we can check is pending, and we're checking whether it's true. And if it's true, we can actually render a p tag also. If we can just do a p tag, right, and inside it, we can just say loading, and just say loading posts. Great. You can just do something like that. So what this tells us is that if the action of fetching the post has not yet completed, we can actually show this loading posts. When we move inside our browser, we can see that we have the data fetching example, and we have the fetch post button here. I'm going to click this, and you can see it's almost instant. That means the start transaction has actually enabled this to run almost immediately. In the second example, we're actually going to look at the importance of useTransition whenever we are actually switching tabs. Therefore, I'm going to clean my code. I'm just going to delete this part, and I can leave the syntax here for is pending and start transition. I'm also going to delete this part here so that we can just remain with div, and I'm also going to delete this type here. Great. And inside here, we can just have also another h1, and we can say this one is tabs example. So useTransition will enable us to actually switch between tabs very quickly, and this will improve the user experience. Great job. I'm also going to have a type here, and it's going to be a type of tab. If we can just do this type, let us declare a type, and we're going to call this type tab, And for this demonstration, we're actually going to have two. It's either going to be users tab or it's going to be the settings tab. You can just do settings like this. You can just come here below this syntax for use transition, and you're going to declare another variable. If you can just say this variable is going to control which tab is active. If you can just say constant, and this time we are going to have a variable known as active tab and another function to set the active tab. If you can just say set active tab like that, and we need to provide the type. Therefore you can just do this, and you can say it's a type of tab, this one that we have defined here, which can either be users or settings. And we also need to provide the initial value, and the initial value can be, let's go with users. So you can just come here inside it, and then we can provide users. You can see we also have the ability to switch. Therefore you can provide the initial value as users. The next thing that we need to do, we can just come here inside, just below this h1 tag, we can have another button here. If we can just say button, and inside this button we can say something like, let's say users, and let me also create another button that will be used to switch between users and settings. Therefore the second button will be for settings. Great. We have two buttons, one is for users and another one is for settings. Great. And we need to attach a function to this. If you can just come here on click, and we need to create another function. So inside the on click, we can actually pass a function that is going to control the switching of tabs. And it's actually very easy. Therefore, how can we actually do it? We can do this. We can have an arrow function here, and then we're going to call another function known as switch tabs. We do not have this one at the moment. Therefore, we can just say switch tab like that. Great. Let me just leave it like this. We don't have this function. Let us define this function here. Therefore, you can just come here on top, and then you can just say function, and it's going to be function switch tab. Great. Like this. Beautiful. And we also need to receive an argument here so that we can know which tab are we actually switching. If you can provide an argument inside here, and I'm going to call this argument just a tab, and inside it we're going to also, and we also need to provide the type. Actually it's not of type any. The type of this argument is actually of this type tab. If you can use this colon, and then you can just do tab like this. Great job. That means switch tab will know that's actually either expecting a users tab or a settings tab. And inside this switch tab, for a smooth switching, we're actually going to use the start transition method. So you can say start transition, this function that we had already defined here, and the start transition is going to take an arrow function. If we can just do an arrow function like this, and inside the arrow function we can call set active tab. Then we can just say set active tab, and inside the set active tab we can pass the argument that we are getting, which is actually the tab that's actually passed here. Great job. Therefore, inside this switching tab here, we need to provide an argument. Even if you hover around it, you can see it actually expects one argument from us. Great. And the type of argument it expects, it's of actually the tab. Great. Therefore, inside it, we can provide either, and you can see we have suggestions. Therefore, since this one is a tab for users, we can select users here. Great job. I'm going to just copy this button, and then I'll use this one for settings. We can do this. I'm going to change this one to settings. Great. And therefore inside here, the switch tab, we can just say settings like that. The next thing we need to set is actually the is pending flag. Great. Therefore we can actually check that. Therefore we can just come here, and then we have to know whether we have pending updates. That means this start transition function has not yet finished. Great. And what can we do? We can render a p tag. So we can just do this. We can render a p tag here. Great. And inside it, we can just say loading tab, and you can do something like that. Beautiful. The next thing that you're going to have is actually a condition. We're going to show something whenever we have the settings tab, and you're also going to show something different whenever we have the users tab. So how can we do that? We're going to check the active tab. If we can say is active tab. And this time we need to check whether the active tab is users. So you can see we also have suggestions. So therefore we can check whether the active tab is users. And if it's users, we can actually simulate something. We can simulate the fetching of, let's say, so many users. We are going to use numbers to simulate this. Therefore we can just come here and we're going to use an array to simulate this. Therefore we can say array, and you're going to use the from method like that. And you're also going to, inside the from method, we can provide an object, an object known as length, which is going to be the length of the array, and the length of the array can be something like 8,000. Great. And at the end of it, you can provide the map function. Therefore you can say dot map. Great. And inside it, you can just provide an underscore and an I. Therefore the underscore and an I will represent the first and the last index of the array, and we are going to map over it using an arrow function. Therefore we can just map over this, and we are going to map over it actually using a p tag, and inside the p tag we can just render the I, the number, and whenever we are mapping using an array, we need to provide a key. Therefore inside the p tag you can say the key, and it's also going to be an I. Great. So to make this one more user friendly, we can say user number 1. So user number 1, number 2, number 3, like that. So therefore we're going to have user number I, and it's going to loop from 1000 to 70999, close to this value. Great. And we can actually see this, but before we see this, let us also do something else when the active tab is not users. Therefore we can also have the condition here again, another condition, and we're just checking also the active tab. Therefore we can check the active tab, and we can actually check whether it's actually settings. And if the active tab is settings, we're going to do something very simple. We're just going to have a p tag here, a HTML p tag. If we can just do HTML like that, and we can say settings page. So from the look of things, the settings page is actually not as heavy as the users page, because the users, we have 8,000 users. Great. And the settings page is just going to show the settings like that. Great job. Beautiful. Whenever we check our tab, I'm going to click on settings, and you can see we have settings here. Therefore setting is instantaneous because it does not have a lot of things. But let us see what will happen whenever we click the users tab. Great. You can see we have loading tab, and this one actually improves the user experience, and it actually loads all the users. And one thing you might be surprised is it's loading all the users from 1 to 7,999. You can see it's a lot of users. So useTransition has actually smoothlined our operation, or it has actually improved the user experience. So if we were not using let's say if we are not using the useTransition, whenever you click on users, let's say you click on users, it will actually freeze. Let us look at the last example, which is going to be a search or filtering example. If I'm going to delete this, you can just delete everything here, and you can just leave the empty divisions here. I'm also going to delete this function here. Great. I'm going to delete this, so that we're just left with spending and start transition, because you're going to work with this. I'm also going to delete the type of user. If we can just delete also this one here. We're going to implement a search box that is going to use useTransition. Therefore, we need to, just below this definition of spending, you can come here below it, and you're going to define another variable, and you're going to call it, we can just call it query, and it's going to hold the query, and another function to set the query. Therefore we can say set query. Great. And we're going to use useState, and we can provide an empty string as the initial value. This query is actually going to store the value that we type in for whenever we want to search something. We also need another variable for the results. Therefore we can say constant, and this time we're going to have results and a function to set the results. Therefore we can say set and then results like this, and we're going to use useState. If we can just say useState, we know one thing, that results is going to be an array. And since you're using TypeScript, this one is optional. You can just say string and then do an array like this. That means the result is going to be an array of strings. Beautiful. The next thing we need to do, just need to come here inside this div, and you can have a h1. This is just for aesthetic purposes, and you can say this is search example. We also need an input that we're going to use to actually pass whatever we want to search. Then we can just say input. Let me just drop this one down, and we're going to have a couple of props. So you can just, we're going to have the value prop, and the value is going to be the query, whatever we want to search, or the search param. Great. You also need another prop, and this time is going to be the placeholder. If you can just placeholder, and you can say search like that. And finally, you also need a function. Therefore, you can just say onChange, and we're going to have a function that we're going to call, and you're going to name that function handle search. We do not have this function yet, and actually let us create this function here. Great. So you can just come here below these definitions. You can just come here, and we need to create this function handle search. If you can say function, and the function is handle search like that. Great job. The next thing we need to do is inside this function handle search, we need to declare another variable, and you're going to call it value. But first, this handle search we need to pass something from it. We're actually passing whatever is actually the user has entered inside the search input. Therefore, we need to provide whatever has been inputted. So therefore, we can just use an E, and we need to provide the type. Therefore, we can say React dot change event. You can say dot change event, and you can provide explicit type, which is HTML input. So it's just an HTML input element like that. Great. And how can we get the value that has actually been passed inside? Therefore, we can say constant value, and we're going to equate these two. So to get the value that has actually been passed by the user, we can say e.target. So you can say e.target.value. Great. And we can test this before we move further. Therefore, we can let me just say alert, so that we know whether we are right. You can just say alert, and this time we can alert value. Great. Let us just test this. I'm going to move back inside here, and you can see we have search example. I'm going to provide just a single letter. Beautiful. And the letter is K, and you can actually see it has actually alerted the value. Beautiful. We need to go back. Therefore, we can just go back. Let us delete this alert, because this was just for testing purposes. All right. After getting what has actually been passed by the user, we need to call the set query, this one here, and we need to pass that. Therefore, we can just call set query, and we're going to pass the value. Great. And then we need to call another function, which is the start transition, which is the start transition we're going to pass inside an arrow function. Therefore, we can just do an arrow function like this. So inside this start transition, we need to get the results, or the filtered results. If we can just comment here and say filtered results. The next thing we need to do is actually define the data that we're going to work with. So we can define some data, and this time I'm going just to mock some data. Therefore, you can say data is equal to, and this time we're also going to use the array. If we can say array.from. Great. And inside it can provide an object, and inside it you can also provide the length of the object or the length of an array, which is going to be, let's say 5,000. You can use any random value that you want, but I'm using a bigger value so that we can actually know the data is big. We can simulate a very big data set. The next parameter we need to provide, we can just provide also the starting index. So we can just provide an underscore like that and an I. And we're also going to have an arrow function here. And then you're going to have backticks, and you can just say item. Let's say item, and this time we can also render the specific number or the specific array. If you can just provide an I here. Great job. All right, to get the filtered result, we can declare a variable known as filtered. If we can say filtered like this, Great. And you're going to check our data, this one here that we have defined here. And we are going to use the filter method to actually get whatever we are looking for. And inside the filter, we can actually pass an item. Therefore, we can just say an item like this and an arrow function. And then what we need to do, we need to take the individual item, and we're actually checking whether it matches the lowercase, and also if it includes the value that has actually been passed in lowercase. Therefore, we can say value dot lowercase to lowercase like that. Ensure you have that. Great job. The next thing we need to do finally, we can just set the results, or set results, and we want to set the results to this filtered value. You can just come here, set results, and then you can provide filtered like that. Beautiful. Great. Immediately after this input field, you can come here, and then we need to check something. We need to check the is pending state, and if it's pending, we can show something. If we can show something like, let's say, a paragraph, a native HTML paragraph, then we can just do this, and inside it we can just say still loading. You can even say it's loading, or you can even say filtering results, something like that. Beautiful. And if it's not pending, that means we have the results. If we can just come here and say results, we need to map. If we can say dot map, and inside it you can take an individual item. We're going to have an arrow function here, and inside the map we're going to also map it using a native HTML paragraph or a p tag. Great. And inside it we can show the item. You can just show the item, and whenever you are looping over an array, it's very important that you provide the key. Then we can just say the key, and this time the key is going to be still the item. So we can just do an item like that. Let us see this in action. I'm going to save this, and I'm moving inside my browser. All right, and we have this search example, and let us search for, let's say, item, and you can see, beautiful. Let us provide something to test this. Let me enlarge this so that it can become more visible. Let's say I'm looking for item, therefore it's item, and you can see we have item, and you can see we have something that is being rendered here, something like filtering results. Great. And item, we can even say 8, and you can see it's item 8. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next tutorial. If you have questions, you can provide them in the comments. Ensure you like, subscribe so that it can reach more developers. See you in the next one.